The sun was slowly setting behind the tall buildings of the city, painting the sky with soft shades of orange and purple. The streets were still busy, filled with people rushing home, cars honking, and bicycles weaving through traffic. Among the crowd, Maya sat behind the wheel of her modest sedan, driving calmly after a long day at work. She wasn't in a hurry. The day had already been exhausting, and she simply wanted to reach her small apartment, change into something comfortable, and enjoy a quiet dinner. Maya lived a life that looked ordinary to most people around her. Neighbors saw her as a polite, quiet young woman who always smiled when she passed by, who watered her plants every morning, and who carried groceries up the stairs without ever asking for help. But what they didn't know was that Maya had a very different side of her life. She worked as a liaison analyst for an intelligence agency, a role that required sharp focus, careful listening, and the ability to stay calm even under pressure. To strangers, she looked like any other office worker. And that was exactly how she wanted it to be. That evening, as she turned onto a quieter street, Maya noticed flashing red and blue lights in her rear-view mirror. A patrol car followed closely behind her. Her stomach sank for a moment. She checked her speed. She wasn't going too fast. She wasn't in the wrong lane. She hadn't crossed any lights. Still, she knew the rules. When the lights came on, you pulled over. She carefully guided her car to the side of the road and rolled down her window. The officer who stepped out was tall, with a firm build and a heavy walk. His nameplate read Rankin. He adjusted his belt as he walked toward her, shining a flashlight into her car though it wasn't yet dark enough to need it. Maya kept her hands visible on the steering wheel, just as she had been trained to do since long ago. Her voice was calm when she greeted him. "Good evening, officer." Rankin didn't return the polite tone. His eyes narrowed as if he was trying to study her face. "Do you know why I stopped you?" he asked, his voice rough and slow. Maya shook her head. "No, officer. I don't believe I was speeding or breaking any rule." "That depends on how you look at it," Rankin said. "You swerved slightly back there. Could be dangerous. Might need to run a few checks." Maya remained still. She knew she hadn't swerved. She had driven with the same steady focus she always did. But instead of arguing, she nodded gently. "I understand." Rankin leaned a little closer toward the open window. "Where are you headed?" "Just going home after work," Maya replied, her voice steady, her tone even. He seemed to take longer than necessary, as if searching for a reason to extend the stop. Maya noticed the pause, the way his eyes lingered not on her documents but on her face. Something about the moment felt wrong. She had been through many interactions with law enforcement in her professional life, most of them respectful, straightforward, and professional. But this felt different. This wasn't about road safety. This was about power. Maya's training reminded her to stay calm. She knew people sometimes used intimidation to test reactions. So she did not raise her voice, did not look away nervously, and did not challenge him directly. She simply waited. Rankin asked for her license and registration. She handed them over carefully, keeping her movements slow and visible. He looked at the documents for longer than necessary, then sighed. "You know," he said, almost casually, "it would be easier if people like you just admitted when they'd made a mistake." Maya tilted her head slightly. "If I made a mistake, I'd like to know what it was." Rankin tapped the license against the car door and gave a half smile. "Sometimes it's better not to make things complicated." She understood the hidden meaning. He was trying to unsettle her, to make her nervous enough to accept whatever story he was shaping. But Maya didn't bite. "I respect the law, officer," she said. "If there's an official citation, I'll accept it." The silence that followed stretched longer than it should have. A car drove by, slowing down slightly as the driver looked curiously at the scene. The hum of city noise filled the air, but inside Maya's car, it felt almost too quiet. Finally, Rankin gave a short nod and walked back toward his car. He stayed there for several minutes, longer than any normal license check would take. Maya sat still, her hands folded on the steering wheel, her breathing calm and steady. Inside, however, she was thinking quickly. She replayed every second in her mind, noting the time, the location, the officer's name. Small details mattered. They always did. When Rankin returned, he handed her documents back with an oddly forced smile. "All right, miss. I'll let you off with a warning this time. Drive safe." "Thank you," Maya replied politely, even though she knew she had done nothing wrong. She took her documents, placed them carefully on the passenger seat, and drove away slowly once he returned to his car. As she drove, the city lights blurred past her window. A mix of feelings ran through her: frustration, unease, but also determination. She had spent years training to stay calm under pressure. And she knew this wasn't the end of the story. Something about that stop had crossed a line, and she wasn't the kind of person to ignore it. When she reached home, Maya placed her bag on the table, pulled out a small notebook, and began writing. She noted the exact time she was stopped, the street name, the officer's badge number, his words, his tone, and the way he prolonged the stop without reason. Every small detail went down in neat handwriting. It wasn't anger that guided her pen. It was clarity. She knew systems worked best when people reported facts, not emotions. Her neighbors and friends might think she was just another woman driving home from work. But in reality, Maya was someone who had learned long ago that silence often allowed unfairness to grow. That night, before she closed her notebook, she looked out the window at the glowing lights of the city. She thought about how many other people might have faced similar situations, people who didn't have her training, her calmness, or her access to proper channels. And she felt a quiet sense of responsibility. She wasn't just going to forget this. Maya didn't know yet how deep this story would go. She didn't know how nervous the officer would become when he discovered who she really was. All she knew, in that quiet moment, was that she had the patience. The next morning began like any other for Maya. She woke up early, prepared her usual cup of black coffee, and sat by the small wooden table near her kitchen window. Outside, the city was already alive with the sounds of buses, horns, and footsteps. Yet, as she stirred the steaming coffee, her mind was not on her daily routine. It was on the strange encounter from the night before. The flashing lights, the long silence, and the officer's tone replayed in her head like an unfinished puzzle. She knew something about it wasn't right. Still, Maya carried on with her day as though nothing had happened. She dressed in her neat office clothes, tied her hair back, and made sure her notebook filled with the details she had written the night before was safely tucked in her bag. She had a long list of tasks at her agency office, and she couldn't let one unpleasant encounter ruin her focus. When she walked into the agency's headquarters, the atmosphere felt the same as always: serious but calm, busy but controlled. People moved with purpose, carrying files, typing quickly, or discussing quietly in hallways. Maya greeted her colleagues politely, placed her bag under her desk, and got straight to work. She reviewed reports, cross-checked data, and made notes for an upcoming briefing. Her mind worked quickly, but somewhere in the back of it, the stop from last night still lingered. During her lunch break, she opened her notebook and quietly reread the page she had filled. The officer's words were clear in her handwriting: "Sometimes it's better not to make things complicated." She tapped her pen against the paper. That sentence carried more weight than it should. It wasn't professional. It wasn't how an officer of the law was supposed to act. Later that afternoon, Maya received a message from a colleague about a community security meeting scheduled for the weekend. The agency often encouraged staff to attend, not as officials but as ordinary citizens who could listen, observe, and connect with people. She decided she would attend. For some reason, she felt that staying connected with the community mattered even more after what had happened to her. That evening, as Maya left the building and walked to her car, she noticed something unusual. Parked across the street was a patrol car. It was the same model as the one that had stopped her. Her eyes narrowed for just a second before she calmly opened her own car door. She didn't want to assume anything, but the thought pressed at her mind, was it the same officer? She drove off as usual, keeping her speed steady and her route normal. Yet in her rear-view mirror, she noticed the patrol car begin to follow. Not directly close, not with lights on, but there always a few cars back, never quite disappearing. She reminded herself not to panic. She stayed calm, drove the normal route home, and parked in her usual spot. As she got out, she glanced back. The patrol car was gone. Maybe it was all coincidence, she told herself. But maybe not. Inside her apartment, she sat down again at her desk and added a second page to her notes: time of day, location of her workplace, and the sighting of the patrol car. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even frightened. She was focused. These details, she knew, might matter later. The following day at work, Maya made a decision. After finishing her tasks, she scheduled a private meeting with her agency's internal legal and ethics officer. She explained, in the same calm tone she always used, the events of the traffic stop, the words the officer had spoken, and the fact that she suspected she had been followed. She slid her notebook across the desk as evidence. The officer listened carefully, his eyes steady as she spoke. When she finished, he nodded. You did the right thing documenting everything immediately. I'll coordinate with the local department's internal affairs division. For now, do not engage directly with the officer again. Let the process handle it. Maya agreed. She trusted the system, but she also knew from her years in intelligence work that people sometimes tried to cover their tracks when they felt exposed. That night, her intuition proved right. As she drove home once again, the same uneasy feeling settled in her chest. She turned left at a light, then right at another, taking a slightly longer route. And sure enough, in her mirror, the patrol car appeared again. This time, Maya didn't head directly home. Instead, she drove to a nearby well-lit grocery store, parked her car, and calmly entered. She spent a few minutes walking the aisles, not to buy anything, but to see if the car would wait. When she finally stepped outside, she noticed the street. The patrol car was no longer there. She made her way home quietly. Later, sitting on her couch with a warm cup of tea, she thought deeply. She realized the situation was no longer about one unpleasant roadside conversation. It was about pressure. The officer seemed to be testing boundaries, trying to remind her that he had authority, that he could make her uncomfortable. What he didn't realize, however, was that Maya was not ordinary. She looked at the notebook on her coffee table, pages filling with details. Each word was a shield, each note a small piece of truth that could not be erased. She thought of the many people who might have been in her shoes, people without her training, people who might have been too scared to report, too unsure to document, or too intimidated to push back. She promised herself that she would see this through, not only for herself but for those voices who went unheard. In the days that followed, she stayed composed at work, never letting the outside events shake her professionalism. Yet behind the calm surface, she prepared carefully. She spoke again with the agency's officer, who informed her that internal affairs had accepted the complaint and would begin reviewing the matter. They needed her cooperation for a formal interview. Maya agreed. She wasn't rushing the process. She wasn't chasing drama. She was patient, measured, and clear. Her training had taught her that real power wasn't in raising one's voice or forcing action, it was in staying steady, recording truth, and letting evidence speak louder than fear. Meanwhile, Officer Rankin began to feel uneasy himself. He had thought the stop would pass unnoticed, just another late evening on patrol. But something about the woman he had tried to intimidate stuck with him. The way she had stayed calm, the way she had refused to be shaken, the way she had looked at him with steady eyes. She wasn't like others. And now, rumors within the department began to reach him that Internal Affairs was asking questions about his conduct. For Maya, life carried on with quiet discipline. She still watered her plants every morning. She still greeted her neighbors with a smile. She still carried groceries up the stairs. Outwardly, nothing had changed. But inwardly, she was building a wall of quiet strength, one note, one report, one decision at a time. The city outside kept moving as if nothing unusual was happening. But Maya knew the story was only beginning. The officer had crossed a line, and sooner or later, he would realize exactly who he had tried to pressure. When that moment came, the balance of power would shift completely. The days passed slowly, and with each one, Maya's sense of quiet determination grew stronger. She had filed her complaint properly, handed over her notes, and spoken clearly with the right people. Now the process was moving forward, though she knew from experience that investigations rarely happened quickly. They took time, patience, and careful checking of every detail. Still, she wasn't in a rush. She understood that steady truth always held more weight than hasty action. At her workplace, Maya kept her focus sharp. She continued reviewing intelligence briefs, helping cross-check reports, and supporting her team. She didn't tell anyone outside the small circle of people who needed to know about the traffic stop. She didn't want whispers or drama. Her calm approach surprised even herself sometimes. But beneath that calmness was a fire, a steady belief that people in positions of authority had to be held accountable. Meanwhile, Officer Rankin felt the ground beneath him begin to shift. In his years on the job, he had grown used to controlling situations, bending his tone, and sometimes leaning on his badge to silence complaints. But something about this case felt different. For one, Internal Affairs had reached out sooner than usual. Questions came quickly: where he had been that evening, what reason he had for stopping Maya, and why the stop had lasted longer than necessary. Rankin thought back to her eyes, the steady, calm way she had spoken, never raising her voice, never losing composure. It was unusual. Most people grew nervous, stumbled over words, or tried to argue. But not her. And when he heard whispers from another officer that the woman worked with federal intelligence, his stomach tightened. If that was true, then this wasn't going to vanish quietly. For Maya, the waiting period wasn't wasted. She spent her evenings continuing her quiet routines. She cooked simple meals, tended to her plants, and read books late into the night. Yet she always kept her notebook close, ready to add any new details. A few more times, she thought she noticed a patrol car following her at a distance. Each time, she wrote it down carefully. She never acted recklessly. Instead, she changed her route, drove through populated areas, or entered well-lit public spaces. Her training reminded her of something important: never confront recklessly, but never ignore patterns either. Evidence built over time, one careful step at a time. One evening, she attended the community security meeting she had marked earlier. People gathered in a large hall at the local library, sitting in rows of plastic chairs. The meeting was meant for ordinary citizens to raise concerns and hear about safety updates. Maya sat quietly near the back, listening as people spoke about small thefts, reckless driving, and local patrols. A few officers stood at the front, answering questions politely. She didn't speak. She simply observed. But what struck her most was how ordinary citizens spoke with both respect and fear toward law enforcement. Some praised their work, while others hesitated, unsure whether their complaints would be taken seriously. Maya realized again how important it was to ensure fairness in such roles. When people lost trust, communities broke down. After the meeting ended, Maya walked home under the dim glow of streetlights. She thought about her own situation. She was fortunate she had resources, training, and systems to lean on. Many people didn't. That thought deepened her resolve to see the process through. The next week, she received a formal notice. Internal Affairs scheduled her for an official interview. They wanted her testimony, details of her notes, and any supporting evidence she might provide. Maya wasn't nervous. She had been trained in structured communication. Facts, not feelings. Dates, times, words. She had all of it ready. The night before the interview, she reviewed her notebook one last time. Each line was neat and clear. She remembered the first moment the officer had leaned into her window, the strange pause when he had returned to his car, the exact sentence that hinted at pressure. She closed the notebook and placed it carefully in her bag. At the same time, Rankin grew restless. He had tried to write a report to justify the stop, but the wording felt weak. Vehicle swerved slightly was not supported by the dash cam. Routine safety check didn't explain the long delay. He thought about adjusting the details, but deep down he knew, cameras didn't lie. And if the woman was truly linked to the CIA, then any false step in his report would only make things worse. That night, Rankin sat in his small apartment, staring at the ceiling. The badge that once gave him confidence now felt heavy. He imagined the questions Internal Affairs would ask, the recordings they might already have, and the quiet strength of the woman he had tried to pressure. For the first time in a long while, he felt real panic. The morning of the interview arrived. Maya walked calmly into the office, dressed neatly, her hair tied back as always. She greeted the investigator politely, took a seat, and laid her notebook on the table. The investigator asked her to describe the stop, step by step. She spoke clearly, without exaggeration. She explained the flashing lights, the questions, the words about not making things complicated, the long pause in his car, and the patrol car she believed had followed her later. She read directly from her notes when necessary, ensuring accuracy. The investigator listened carefully, nodding as she spoke. "Thank you," he said finally. "Your report matches with the timeline we are already reviewing. We'll compare it with the body cam and dash cam footage." Maya gave a polite nod. She didn't need to say more. The facts would speak for themselves. When she left the building, the morning sun felt warm on her face. She walked to her car, unlocked the door, and sat quietly for a moment. She wasn't celebrating, and she wasn't angry. She was steady, calm, and certain that the process was moving in the right direction. Inside the department, Rankin received his own notice. He was to appear before Internal Affairs as well. The walls felt as though they were closing in on him. He had spent years feeling in control, but now every step felt uncertain. His choices were being weighed, his words being measured, and his actions being compared with hard evidence. For Maya, life continued with the same quiet discipline. She still watered her plants every morning. She still bought groceries from the same little shop. She still greeted her neighbors with a smile. Outwardly, nothing about her had changed. But inside, she knew the balance of power was beginning to shift. The story was far from over. The truth was slowly unfolding, and sooner or later, the officer would learn exactly who he had tried to pressure. That realization would shake him more than anything else. The day of the formal review arrived, and the air inside the Internal Affairs office was heavy with quiet tension. Files stacked neatly on desks, officers moving quickly through hallways, and investigators whispering over evidence all created an atmosphere that felt different from the regular rhythm of a police station. It wasn't loud or rushed, but focused, like everyone there understood the seriousness of the work. Maya walked into the building with her usual calm grace. She wore a simple navy blue suit, her hair tied back, and carried only her notebook and a slim folder. She didn't need much else. Everything important was already written down and stored clearly. She greeted the receptionist politely and was shown into a room where the investigators would soon join her. The room was plain white walls, a long wooden table, a few chairs, and a small camera in the corner recording the session. Maya sat down, placed her folder neatly in front of her, and waited. She wasn't nervous. Years of experience had taught her that nerves wasted energy. What mattered was clarity, precision, and patience. A few minutes later, two investigators entered the room. They introduced themselves formally, shook her hand, and took their seats across the table. One opened a file while the other set up a laptop. "Thank you for coming today," the lead investigator said. "We appreciate your cooperation. As you know, this is part of our internal process to ensure proper conduct and accountability. We'll go through your statement carefully and ask follow-up questions." Maya nodded. "Of course. I'll provide whatever information you need." The questioning began. They asked her to recount every detail of the traffic stop: how the lights appeared in her rearview mirror, how the officer approached, what words were exchanged, and how long the stop lasted. Maya spoke clearly, never rushing, never exaggerating. She read some lines directly from her notebook to ensure accuracy. When they asked about the sentence "sometimes it's better not to make things complicated," Maya repeated it exactly as she remembered. The investigators exchanged a brief glance, then wrote notes quickly. They explained that body cam recordings often picked up conversations, so her testimony would be checked against the footage. After nearly an hour of careful questioning, the session ended. The investigators thanked her again, collected copies of her notes, and told her they would be in touch soon. Maya rose, shook their hands politely, and walked out. Meanwhile, Officer Rankin was having a very different kind of day. He had received his notice to appear for questioning the same week, and it had weighed heavily on him. Sitting in his small kitchen that morning, he had barely touched his breakfast. His mind kept spinning through possibilities: maybe the woman hadn't reported him, maybe it would blow over, maybe the cameras hadn't caught the words clearly. But deep down, he knew better. When his turn came, Rankin sat across from the same investigators. His voice carried less confidence than usual. He repeated the story he had written in his report: that he believed Maya had swerved slightly, that he had stopped her for safety reasons, and that he had given her a warning before letting her go. But when the investigators asked why the stop had lasted so long, his answers faltered. They played a portion of the body cam footage. The audio was clear enough: his tone, his words, and the silence that stretched in between. The phrase "better not to make things complicated" was there, recorded for all to hear. Rankin's face grew pale. He tried to explain it away as casual wording, but the investigators pressed. Why had he said it? What did he mean by it? Rankin stumbled. For the first time in years, the authority of his badge didn't feel like protection. It felt like a spotlight exposing every misstep. Back at her agency office, Maya was informed through her liaison officer that the investigation was moving forward quickly. The department had already compared her testimony with the recordings, and the evidence supported her. She didn't celebrate, but she felt a quiet satisfaction. Truth was standing firm. Days later, whispers began to circulate in the police department. Some officers had heard that Rankin was under review. Others speculated about the woman involved, surprised that the case had escalated so quickly. When Rankin overheard one officer mention that the woman was connected to federal intelligence, his chest tightened. It was true, then. This wasn't just an ordinary driver. This was someone with connections, training, and a system behind her. That night, Rankin sat alone in his living room, the television flickering silently in the background. His thoughts raced. If she was truly a CIA agent, then she hadn't just reported him, she had reported him with precision. Every word, every pause, every look had probably been noted down. Panic rose in him. What had seemed like a small moment of control during a roadside stop had now turned into a career-threatening mistake. For Maya, the matter remained professional and calm. She didn't think of it as personal revenge. She thought of it as accountability. Authority should never be abused, and pressure should never be used against those who trusted the system. The climax of the case came when Internal Affairs called for a joint session with the department's leadership. They presented their findings: the stop had been unnecessary, the officer's words were inappropriate, and the recordings confirmed the complainant's account. Rankin sat stiffly in the room, his hands clenched on the table. The chief spoke clearly. This department cannot allow behavior that undermines public trust. Disciplinary measures will be taken. Rankin lowered his head. Panic surged through him, but there was nothing more he could say. His authority had slipped away, not because someone shouted louder, but because the truth had been written down, recorded, and revealed at the right time. Maya didn't attend that session. She didn't need to. She had already done her part. When she was informed afterward of the outcome, she nodded quietly and returned to her regular work. For her, this wasn't about victory or defeat. It was about balance, ensuring that systems meant to protect people actually worked as they should. That evening, as she walked home under the glow of the streetlights, Maya reflected on everything that had happened. She thought of the moment she had been stopped, the unease she had felt, and the choice she had made to stay calm and document. She thought of the community members at the security meeting, hesitant but hopeful for fairness. And she thought of how even small actions like writing down a sentence at the right moment could shift an entire story. The panic that Rankin now felt was not her goal, but it was the natural result of choices he had made. Power misused always carried consequences. And truth, sooner or later, always found its way forward. The weeks that followed brought a quiet but meaningful change to Maya's life. The case was not splashed across newspapers or shouted about in headlines. It wasn't the kind of story that made its way into the public spotlight. But inside the walls of the police department and within the corridors of her own agency, it was taken seriously. What had begun as a routine traffic stop had turned into a lesson about power, accountability, and the strength of staying calm when it mattered most. When Maya received the final report from Internal Affairs, she sat at her desk and read it carefully. The words were formal, written in official language, but their meaning was clear. The complaint had been sustained. Officer Rankin had acted without proper cause, his words had been inappropriate, and his handling of the situation had undermined the trust placed in him. As a result, disciplinary measures were being taken. The details of those measures weren't hers to decide, they were internal matters, but the most important thing had been achieved: the truth had been recognized. She closed the report, placed it neatly in her folder, and exhaled slowly. There was no joy in seeing another person face punishment. She didn't celebrate his downfall. Instead, she felt a steady relief that the system had worked the way it was supposed to. Her small act of writing notes, of staying composed, had made a difference. At the same time, changes began to ripple through the department. A new memo was issued about the handling of traffic stops. Supervisors reminded officers that body cam footage would be checked regularly, that prolonged stops without reason would be flagged, and that community complaints would be reviewed with priority. None of these steps were dramatic, but together they represented progress. Trust, once damaged, could only be rebuilt piece by piece. In her personal life, Maya returned to her normal rhythm. She continued to wake up early, water her plants, and walk to the local market on weekends. Neighbors greeted her as they always did, with small smiles and waves. They had no idea about the storm she had quietly navigated in recent weeks, and that was exactly how Maya wanted it. Her life, in many ways, looked unchanged on the outside. But inside, she carried the quiet satisfaction of someone who had faced a challenge and come through with dignity intact. Meanwhile, Rankin faced the consequences of his actions. For him, the panic had not ended with the investigation. The knowledge that he had tried to pressure the wrong person weighed heavily on him. More than the punishment itself, it was the realization that his behavior had been seen clearly, recorded, and judged fairly. He had been stripped of the false confidence that once made him believe no one would question him. Within the department, his colleagues treated him differently. Some avoided him, not wanting to be associated with trouble. Others looked at him with disappointment, knowing that his choices reflected poorly on the badge they all wore. The uniform was supposed to represent safety, fairness, and honor. Rankin had betrayed that, and the reminder stayed with him. For Maya, the experience became a quiet reminder of the values she held most dear. She never wanted recognition or praise. She didn't need people to know that she was connected to intelligence work, or that her report had pushed a case forward. What mattered to her was simple: no one, no matter their position, should misuse authority. And when they did, someone had to stand up, not with anger or noise, but with truth, clarity, and patience. She thought often about the community meeting she had attended. She remembered the hesitant voices of people who weren't sure if their complaints would matter. She hoped that the changes in the department, however small, might encourage those people to speak with more confidence in the future. She hoped they would believe that fairness was possible, even if it wasn't always immediate. One evening, Maya sat by her window with a cup of tea, watching the lights of the city sparkle against the night sky. She thought about the journey she had been on. It had started with a stop on a quiet street, a moment that could have easily been brushed aside, forgotten, or ignored. But instead, she had chosen a different path: to record, to report, and to trust the process. That choice had led to accountability, and accountability had led to change. She realized something important. Courage wasn't always about grand gestures or dramatic fights. Sometimes, courage was simply about staying calm, refusing to be intimidated, and trusting that truth would shine through in the end. The lesson stayed with her: every small act of clarity had the power to ripple outward. Every person who chose not to stay silent added strength to the system. And every time truth was recognized, even quietly, it built a foundation for greater trust in the future. As for Maya, she closed her notebook at last. Its pages were filled with neat handwriting, every detail recorded, every event remembered. She placed it back on her shelf, not as a burden, but as a reminder. A reminder that even in ordinary moments, extraordinary lessons could be found. Her story was not about titles or agencies. It wasn't about power or revenge. It was about dignity, patience, and the belief that fairness mattered. And as she finished her tea, Maya smiled softly, knowing she had done her part. The city outside kept moving, buses roaring past, footsteps echoing on sidewalks, laughter spilling from cafes. Life went on, just as it always did. But somewhere in the quiet corner of her apartment, one woman sat with the steady knowledge that she had made a difference. And that was enough.